In May of 1945, Dutch police arrested a wealthy Amsterdam painter named Han van Meegeren for one of the gravest crimes on the books, selling a national treasure to the Nazis. The treasure was a Vermeer, and the buyer was Hermann Goering, the second most powerful man in the Third Reich. Facing a potential death penalty for collaboration, van Meegeren offered a defense so absurd that nobody in the room believed a word of it. He said the Vermeer was not a Vermeer at all, because he had painted it himself. And to prove it, he was about to do the one thing no forger in history ever volunteers to do: forge a masterpiece in front of witnesses. Open tonight's case file, and it begins, as the best ones in the vault so often do, with a bruised ego. Henricus Antonius van Meegeren was born in 1889 in the Dutch town of Deventer, and let the record show that the man could genuinely paint. As a young artist he won prizes, sold portraits to wealthy clients, and filled exhibitions in The Hague. But the critics of the 1920s wanted bold and modern, and van Meegeren painted like the 17th century had never ended. They called his work derivative and imitative, the output of a technically gifted man with nothing of his own to say. Reviews like that leave marks, and van Meegeren reportedly nursed the wound for years. Now, most insulted artists write an angry letter, or paint something spiteful, or simply pour another drink. Van Meegeren chose a stranger revenge. He would beat the critics with their own gods. If the experts worshipped the old masters, he would make an old master, and watch them kneel before a painting he had invented. Through the mid-1930s he withdrew to a villa in the south of France and turned forgery into a laboratory science. He bought genuine 17th century canvases and scraped them down to the ground layer, so the age of the fabric itself would pass inspection. He ground his own pigments the old way, reportedly including real lapis lazuli for the blues, and worked with badger hair brushes like the masters had. His masterstroke was chemistry. He mixed his paints with an early plastic resin called Bakelite, and baked the finished canvas in an oven until the surface hardened like paint 3 centuries old. Rolled over a cylinder, the baked surface cracked into a perfect craquelure, that fine web of age that experts trusted with their reputations. Then he chose his target, and credit where it is due, he did not aim small. Johannes Vermeer of Delft left behind only around 3 dozen paintings, and the art world has ached for more ever since. Better still for our purposes, scholars suspected Vermeer had a lost early religious period, a gap in the record that no painting had ever filled. So van Meegeren did not copy a known Vermeer, he forged the missing one that the experts already wanted to exist. He painted a large biblical scene, Christ breaking bread with his disciples, and gave it the title, The Supper at Emmaus. In 1937 the canvas surfaced through an intermediary, wrapped in a discreet story about an old family collection abroad. It landed in front of Abraham Bredius, the most feared and respected Vermeer authority alive. Bredius was in his early 80s, a scholar whose single word could crown a painting or destroy it. He examined the Supper at Emmaus and declared it a genuine Vermeer in print, reportedly hailing it as a masterwork of the Delft painter. The Boijmans Museum in Rotterdam paid 520,000 guilders to secure it, an enormous sum in 1937. It hung in a place of honor, the crowds filed past, and critics admired brushwork that was roughly 2 years old. Somewhere, one imagines, van Meegeren read the reviews of his own fake and smiled the way only a vindicated man can. And that, by rights, should have been the end of it. The revenge was complete. But the money, it turns out, was even sweeter than the vindication. A newly discovered Vermeer was worth more than a lifetime of honest portraits, and van Meegeren discovered he rather enjoyed being rich. More biblical fakes followed from the same oven, sold as Vermeers, along with forgeries in the style of Pieter de Hooch. Buyers paid fortunes, partly because that first fake had quietly rewritten what everyone believed early Vermeer looked like. Each new forgery matched the last forgery, so the experts saw a coherent lost period where there was only a production line. Over his career the fakes reportedly earned somewhere between 5.5 and 7.5 million guilders, roughly $25 to $30 million in today's money. He bought properties, threw lavish parties, and lived like a man laundering a secret, because that is exactly what he was. Then the Second World War arrived, and with it the most dangerous customer in Europe. Hermann Goering, chief of the Luftwaffe and Hitler's designated successor, was buying and looting art on a continental scale. His appetite for masterpieces was matched only by Hitler's own, and both men wanted a Vermeer of their own. In 1942, through a chain of dealers, one of Van Meegeren's fakes reached Goering, a canvas called Christ with the Adulteress. Goering paid 1,650,000 guilders for it, around $624,000 American dollars at the time. The price was reportedly settled largely in kind, with other paintings from Goering's own collection changing hands to cover it, 137 of them by one accounting. Sit with that for a moment. One of the most rapacious collectors in history handed over a hoard of real art for a fake that had been baked in an oven. Goering hung his Vermeer with pride, convinced he had outmaneuvered the market, and possibly Hitler, for a piece of Dutch genius. Van Meegeren had taken a fortune from the Nazi elite in exchange for a worthless canvas, which in hindsight sounds almost patriotic. The trouble is that in 1942 nobody knew it was worthless, including the country that would soon put him on trial for selling it. In May 1945 the war in Europe ended, and Allied investigators began untangling the greatest art theft in history. Goering's hoard was recovered, reportedly including the prized Vermeer pulled from storage in an Austrian salt mine, and every transaction in it had a paper trail. That trail wound backwards through a chain of dealers and stopped at the door of Han van Meegeren. On the 29th of May 1945, Dutch officers arrested him in Amsterdam. The charge was collaboration, trading away a piece of the Dutch national soul to the enemy. In the raw months after liberation, that charge carried a potential death penalty. So Van Meegeren sat in custody and weighed two possible confessions: traitor or fraud. Either he had sold a priceless Vermeer to the Nazis, or he had spent a decade defrauding museums, collectors, and the entire scholarly establishment. After days of questioning, he reportedly chose the second crime and announced that there was no Vermeer to betray. He told his interrogators he had painted the Goering picture himself, and the celebrated supper at MS2, and others besides. The investigators did not believe him, and honestly, detective to detective, I understand why. The supper at Emmaus was hanging in Rotterdam as a crown jewel of Dutch art, blessed by the greatest expert of the age. Claiming to have painted it sounded less like a defense and more like a doomed man insulting a national treasure on his way out. So Van Meegeren made an offer that no ordinary liar would ever make. "Give me canvas, brushes, and my materials," he said in effect, "and I will paint you a brand new Vermeer while you watch." From July to December 1945, under the eyes of appointed witnesses, Van Meegeren painted. Officials and reporters watched a chain-smoking prisoner summon the 17th century out of thin air, brushstroke by brushstroke. He was reportedly allowed the comforts he insisted he needed to work, and he worked like a man whose life depended on every glaze, because it did. The picture that emerged was a large biblical scene in his signature fake Vermeer manner, titled Jesus Among the Doctors. A young Christ holding his own among the learned men, painted by a forger surrounded by his own examiners. An irony this Raven can only applaud. He reportedly declined to fully finish and age the canvas, so that no one could ever pass this one off as a genuine Vermeer. By the time he set down the brush, the impossible defense had hardened into a very uncomfortable fact. Because if this prisoner had painted the Amors, then Dutch museums, Dutch scholars, and a great deal of Dutch money had been fooled for years. A commission of experts was assembled to put the paintings through every test that science could offer. X-rays found the ghosts of older compositions beneath the biblical scenes, exactly where scraped-down antique canvases would leave them. Chemical analysis found the telltale resin in the paint layers, an artificial plastic that no 17th century painter could have touched. Point by point, the forger's own recipe convicted his paintings and, in the strangest way, acquitted the man. The trial opened in Amsterdam in the autumn of 1947, and it looked like no trial the Netherlands had ever staged. The collaboration charge had fallen away, since you cannot betray your country with a painting you made yourself, and what remained were charges of forgery and fraud. His fake Vermeers were hung on the courtroom walls as evidence, which made it quite possibly the best-attended Van Meegeren exhibition ever mounted. The man the critics had dismissed finally had his one-man show, curated, with no sense of irony at all, by the prosecution. Spectators packed the courtroom, and the mood ran closer to theatre than treason. And somewhere in the middle of it all, the public quietly changed sides. This was not the traitor who sold a Vermeer to Goering, this was the Dutchman who sold Goering a fake. In a country still bleeding from occupation, swindling the Reichsmarschall out of a fortune read less like a crime and more like resistance with a paintbrush. Reportedly, when Goering was informed in Allied custody that his treasured Vermeer was a forgery, witnesses described him as visibly stunned. On the 12th of November 1947, the court convicted van Meegeren of forgery and fraud. The sentence was 1 year in prison, a remarkably soft landing for a man who had once faced talk of a death sentence. Van Meegeren never served a single day of it. 2 weeks after the verdict, on the 26th of November, a heart attack struck. He died in Amsterdam on the 30th of December 1947, his sentence still untouched. He made his exit, in other words, at the precise peak of his fame, convicted, celebrated, and never once behind a prison door. And in the years that followed, something remarkable happened to his reputation. The Dutch public reportedly came to rank him among the most beloved rogues in the country, the swindler who out-swindled Goering. His forgeries became collector's items in their own right, fakes now prized precisely because everyone knows who really painted them. Which leaves the uncomfortable question he built his whole crime around. If a painting can move experts to reverence right up until the moment it gets a new name, what exactly were they admiring, the canvas or the label? Van Meegeren never got the verdict he truly wanted, that his own work was great, but he proved something sharper. That the people who judged him could not tell the difference. A raven has a certain professional respect for anyone who feathers their nest with other birds' shiny things, but even I tip my beak to a man who forged his way into a death cell and painted his way back out. I am Quill, and if you enjoy cases where the confession is stranger than the crime, perch here a while and subscribe to the History Vault.